Good day, folks. Today we're going to take a look at some ND filters by Freewell Gear for the Mavic 2 Pro. We're going to talk about why and when you would use them. But first, let's open them up and we'll take a closer look at them. So Freewell Gear sells all kinds of ND filters for many different drones and GoPros. In fact, I own ND filters for many of the other drones, including my GoPro. These are for the Spark. This is for the Mavic Air. The Freewell Gear ND filters are actually really good quality. And I imagine the ones for the Mavic 2 Pro will be no exception, but we'll definitely be testing them out. Now, for the most part, they sell two kits. They sell a Bright Day filter 4-pack and a Standard Day filter 4-pack. Basically, the difference is these ones have higher ND values and they have a built-in polarizer, whereas these ones are just standard ND filters. So we'll talk about what the difference is here in a minute. So in the Standard Day pack, you get an ND4, an ND8, an ND16, and you get a polarizing filter. That's just a standalone polarizing filter. In the Bright Day pack, you get an ND8 with polarizer, an ND16 with polarizer, an ND32 with polarizer, and an ND64 with polarizer. Now, with the Mavic 2 Pro and its Hasselblad camera, technically you don't really need an ND filter. Because it now has a variable aperture, you can go from 2.8 all the way up to 11, you can get the desired shutter speed without having to put on an ND filter. Now just let me explain here, if you're new to this, maybe you have a Mavic 2 and that's your first drone. Basically what an ND filter is, it's a pair of sunglasses. You've probably heard that term over and over again. It's a pair of sunglasses for your drone. Now ND filters don't enhance your video or photos in any other way. It doesn't make saturation any better, except when we're talking about the polarizing. Now what these allow you to do is set your shutter speed to get the proper exposure when you're trying to adhere to the 180 degree rule. And basically the 180 degree rule is, it states that you should have your shutter speed double that of your frame rate. So for example, if you're shooting at 30 frames per second, you want to set your shutter speed to 1/160th of a second. If you're shooting at 60 frames per second, you want to set your shutter speed to 1/120th of a second. Now on drones with fixed apertures, when you try and set your shutter speed to say 1/160th of a second, it is way overblown. It's way too bright. The exposure is way off. Now with the Mavic 2, we can adjust the aperture. So if we're setting it at 1/160th of a second, we can adjust the aperture all the way up to 11, and that will help darken the image. Now, why we want to adhere to the 180 degree rule is that it adds motion blur to our video. So when you're flying and there's some kind of action on the screen, you get a little bit of blur around the action. Now, the video is still nice and crisp, just things moving. Like for example, when I move my hand here, you can see that there's some blur there. Without that blur, everything looks very stark and jittery and just doesn't look very pleasant. So to get that nice cinematic footage, you want a bit of motion blur and you want to adhere to the 180 degree rule, and that's where ND filters come in. Now with the Mavic 2, like I said, you can adjust the aperture to help achieve that 180 degree rule without it being overblown. So the question is, well, why do you need ND filters for the Mavic 2 Pro? Well, there's a couple reasons. For example, I was out a couple days ago. It was an extremely bright day, and I set my aperture right up to f11, and it was still too overexposed. The other reason is sometimes you don't want an f11 aperture. You might want to have it down to 2.8, and that's where you would want your ND filter, because then you can set the appropriate shutter speed. So in the beginning, it's kind of a trial and error, which ND filter to use. You might start with an ND4 and find that's still not dark enough. You might move up to the ND8. So let's just open them up first, and then we'll talk about what the differences between them. So as you can see here, they have these nice new cases, and here are the lenses here. And I'll show you how to put them on in a minute. So basically the difference between the two lenses is this is a straight up ND filter. With these ones here, they're an ND filter, but they have the added bonus of having a polarizer. And what polarizers do is it helps cut back all the glare so your colors can really come through. It helps with saturation and vibrancy, and they do a really good job. Now the one thing to remember with a polarizer filter is that it has to be used at 90 degrees to the sun. So if you're shooting with the sun in front of you or behind you, you get no polarization effect at all. You can still use the lens, but you don't get the added benefit of having the glare cut out. So ideally you want to use these at 90 degrees to the sun. So if you're a person who doesn't want to mess around with polarizers, you're best to stick with the Standard Day pack. The first time taking it off, you might have to put a little pressure on it, but basically you're just going to grab onto the camera and you're just going to twist it and it'll pop right off. Just like that. And you can see it comes right off. So you're going to take it You're going to line it into the holes and then just snapping it back into place. Just like that. And there we go. We've got the nice Freewell Gear ND filter on there. So anyways, let's head out and I'll show you some examples of with and without the ND filter, and then we'll wrap up the video. So for my test, I first put the Mavic Air up in full auto mode, and it's a fairly bright day, and you can see it set the shutter speed at 1/5000th of a second. Now it's pretty high. If you're flying fast over tree canopies or the ground fairly low down, it's going to be very stark and jittery and just not look very pleasant. For my next test, I installed an ND8 filter, and then when I put it up, I had it in shutter priority mode and set the shutter speed to 1/160th of a second. You can see the drone set the f-stop at 5.6, and it's exposed not too badly. So now let's take a look at some footage with the ND filter installed and without the ND filter installed, and we'll see what the difference is. So now I'm just going to grab a couple screenshots to compare the difference. Now this first slide is without an ND filter, and if you look down at the corn, which I'm flying above, it's very clear. You can see almost every stalk of corn. So now this next slide with an ND filter, the ND8, and I got my shutter speed set at 1/160th of a second, you can see that there's a bit of blur in the corn. It's very subtle, but that's all you want. You just want that subtle blur, and it just looks more appealing when trying to get cinematic footage. So yeah, folks, that is the ND filters by Freewell Gear. A nice quality ND filter, nice affordable price. You definitely will be happy with them. They do a great job. Well, folks, what I'll do is I'll include the links down below to these Freewell ND filters, both the standard day pack and the bright day pack. They also have an all day pack, which basically has all these lenses in one kit. I want to thank you for taking the time to watch the video. Hopefully you learned something. Hopefully you enjoyed it. Give it a thumbs up if you did. Don't forget to subscribe to my channel so you don't miss any of our upcoming videos. We'll see you in the next one.